A warm welcome to you all, even though it's a fairly cold and damp evening. My name's Robin Mason. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at the University of Birmingham. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you here this evening to, as the slide previously suggests, looking at the road ahead for Brexit. The idea this evening is that we'll explore the potential effects that Brexit may have on a range of issues that are important to all of us in this room, including health, migration, and the economy. Now, of course, Brexit, as it currently stands, is uncharted territory for everyone. There are many uncertainties that we still face about what the final Brexit deal will look like. And with Brexit talks, if not in deadlock, then at least somewhat stalled, we are to an extent in an information vacuum, which is making it difficult for individuals, businesses, and other organizations to plan and look ahead. Now, we think it's exactly in this type of situation that there is a key role to be played for dispassionate analysis and objective research, and that's exactly what the University of Birmingham has been doing, actually since before the referendum. So we were looking ahead, thinking about the consequences of the referendum, exploring the potential for Brexit, and looking at possible impacts. And our world-leading researchers continue to play an important part in developing a deeper understanding of the potential impacts of Brexit, but based on rigorous and objective academic research. Now, as most of you in this room will know, the University of Birmingham is the UK's first civic university. And as a civic university, the city of Birmingham and the wider West Midlands are at the heart of what we do. So it's perhaps not surprising, therefore, that several areas of our research focus on the impact of Brexit look at what will happen to lives and the economy here in our city and region. And we think that the insights and findings from our research projects will be invaluable for helping us practically to navigate through how we prepare for leaving the EU and everything that follows subsequently. We were very pleased earlier this year to be successful in securing funding for 3 out of the 25 research projects that the Economic and Social Research Council is funding on Brexit. And this evening, actually, researchers from these 3 projects are among the speakers, joined by 3 other leading academics. Now, quite excitingly, or quite dauntingly, depending on whether you've got to listen to it or actually do it, the presentations this evening will be done in a Pecha Kucha style. I haven't experienced that myself. I'm very pleased to say that I'm free from the rigors of that particular discipline when giving this introduction. How it works, it originated in Japan, and each presenter will have a slideshow. Each slide will last for 20 seconds, and each presenter will have 20 slides. So you can do the maths as to how long each speaker will speak for. I don't think any of our presenters this evening have done this particular format before, and perhaps it's going to be new to you. So I think we're going to have a fascinating evening, not just of content, but also a little bit of stylistic innovation. So, on to the speakers. Tonight, we'll hear from Nando Sigona, who will talk about the effects on EU families and Euro children in Britain. Kelly Hall will speak to us about the effects of Brexit on British pensioners currently living in Spain. Mark Exworthy will talk about the impact of Brexit on the NHS and its patients. And Jean McHale will discuss the impact of Brexit on regulating pharmaceuticals and clinical trials. Raquel Ortega Arguelles will speak about the economic impacts of Brexit on the UK, its regions, its cities, and its sectors. And then finally, John Bryson will talk about living and working in post-Brexit Birmingham. and then we'll have a Q&A session which will be chaired by Karen Rowlington. So before I bring onto stage our first speaker, let me just wrap up by stating that the University of Birmingham, although a civic university and rooted in Birmingham and the region, it's also a global university in every part of our outlook. Post-Brexit, whatever the shape of that Brexit, we will continue to nurture and value our European partnerships and collaborations and the contributions of all our EU colleagues and students. So, I hope you enjoy the presentations. I'm sure you will. Please do also stay for the drinks reception at the end of the event, where you'll have the chance to engage with the world-leading researchers who will be speaking this evening and engage them in dialogue and ask them questions. So, it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Nando Sagona, who's Deputy Director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity. Nando has over 15 years' experience of research and teaching in migration, refugees, citizenship, and ethnic studies, and is also one of the founding editors of Migration Studies, an international academic journal published by Oxford University Press. Please join me in welcoming Nando to the stage.
Good evening. Ready to go now? Okay, what I'm going to talk tonight is this project funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, looking at the impact of Brexit on European families and their children. The point is, what's the impact of a divorce after 44 years of membership? Not just on the economy, but on families, on the kids that are born within these families. This is what we're trying to find out. The main idea is that as part of the Brexit and the transformation that is bringing, what does it mean to be us and them has been recast and changed over the periods that, over the last 2 years and in the years to come. So what we're trying to do is, who is us, who is them, we are asking. And how are we going to do it? First of all, we are doing a mapping of the EU nationals in all the British nations. And we also look at the profile of the EU families. The second things we are doing is to speak with these families and try to understand more closely how EU families is being affected by Brexit. But when we talk about EU families, we don't mean only the foreigners. The point is of the research is that a lot of these families are mixed nationality families. In not all cases, you have people with dual nationality, dual passports. So it's much more complex and complicated to separate drastically between us and them. And finally, we want to talk to the children of these families. They are born in UK, and what we call them the second-generation Europeans, to understand how, in a context that has been very much in turbulent times, where the meaning of being British and European challenged, how are they positioning themselves? How do they understand who they are? So the mapping, as the first part of this research, what we are trying to do is to look at where EU nationals live in Britain, where the families live, and then also find out about these UK-born children. We want to find out about the socioeconomic status, the context where they live in terms of how do they relate to the other non-nationals in that area. And then we look at how these things relate to each other. Just to give you an example, we talk often of the 3 million when we talk about EU nationals. Actually, according to the Office of National Statistics, it's at least 3.5 million people we are talking about. However, if you look at this chart, what is interesting is that there is a discrepancy between those that are born in Europe and those that have the European passports. So the point here is that EU nationals are spread all over the country, but in different ways. And what we try to find out is that how this distribution affects also other aspects of British society. Just to give you an example, when we talk about these 3 millions, over the 3.5 million, over 3 million of them are actually in England. So much smaller groups are hosted live in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. It's also important to look at how they related to the non-EU population. So you would see in some areas where you have a high proportion of EU nationals and a small proportion of non-EU nationals. In other cases, you have a much longer, wider proportion of non-EU nationals, which often are citizen of former colonies and citizen subject of the Commonwealth. And then you can also start to understand the complexity of this relation if you take into account the local variations. If you look at a closer level, if you look at the level of the cities, you also get some interesting representation of this distribution. Just to give you an example, for example, there are cities like Salford where the EU nationals are more than the non-EU nationals, so the number of EU nationals is more. In other cases, like, for example, in Birmingham, the population of non-EU nationals is much wider than the one that are born in the EU. And if you look at the case of London, London is, in a sense, is a special case in Britain. You have about, just in London itself, you have about 1 million EU nationals, born national there, and many more non-EU national. The focus of the research is also on children. And we want to look at about children as the new generation, the one that will have to live outside in the sense of the EU family itself. And we try to map the distribution of the children, where these EU children are born, in relation to the British population, the British-born population, but also to the relation to the non-national. And when we talk about EU children, we also important to look in what kind of families they're born. As I said before, in some cases they're born in families which both parents are born in EU, in some cases in the mixed nationality families. And you can see from this graph how there are different kind of configuration of families that we need to look at and take into account. How are they coping with Brexit? Many have applied for the permanent residency. That was basically a piece of paper that was showing that they had the right to stay in Britain. And you can see the peak in application. Interestingly enough, the one that grows faster are from the EU14, so the nationals of the old member state, which up until now they felt secure, and then suddenly they found that their position was threatened. But that didn't work out because basically the government said that the PR was not enough. So a lot of people are now applying for citizenship, for naturalization. And you can see in the last year alone, while 10 years ago, about 5% of the application for naturalization were from EU nationals. Now it's 25%. It's much more than EU nationals that apply. The plan B is actually leaving the country. And you will see an increase in the number, not only an increase in the number of EU nationals that are coming in, but also between an increase in the number of those who were here and then are leaving. So just to conclude, 40 years of membership really means that people have fell in love, had kids, they built families. So a clear-cut separation between us and them is not only difficult, in some cases it's impossible. We are trying to look at both qualitative data and quantitative data just to disentangle this relationship and show the extent to which European families are, how they're coping with it, but also how they feel in terms of their identities and their sense of belonging. If you want to find out more about the project, here there is the website, www.eurochildren.info. Thank you.
Nando, thank you very much. So next to the stage, as we keep these the revolutions going, is Dr. Kelly Hall, who's lecturer in social policy based in the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology. Kelly's research interests include aging, retirement, migration, health and social care in the third sector. And Kelly's going to talk to us about how Brexit will affect British pensioners in Spain. Kelly, thank you.
So I've been researching retirement migration for over a decade now, focusing particularly on older British people in Spain. And recently this has led me to explore the impact of Brexit. So in February this year, I spoke to 25, so I did interviews with 25 British pensioners in the Costa del Sol and asked them about their initial reactions to the referendum and if this changed their future plans in any way. So there are 168,000 British pensioners resident and registered in Spain, but this is people who are registered, and there's many more who maybe are not registered or only spend part of the year in Spain. So who are these people? Brits in Spain, you've got your stereotypes, but older British people are actually quite diverse. What does unite them is their love for Spain and the fact that it enables them to have a better quality of life from the better climate, which can alleviate health problems, and also cheaper living costs and better weather mean people can enjoy a more active and outdoor lifestyle. So there's a strong sense of community among British people in Spain, especially in the sort of costas. Most make many friends, join social clubs and events, and have a much better quality of life and social life than they would in the UK. Now, of course, on the other side of this, there are a growing number of people who have become older, frail, and vulnerable and do need additional care and support. Some people might want to return to the UK in their old age, but actually most people I've spoken to said that they would prefer to stay in Spain. That's where their home is, and they've lived there often for a decade or more, so see Spain as their home. So what does Brexit mean for these people? Mostly it's led to a huge amount of uncertainty. People I've spoken to talked about betrayal, talked about uncertainty, talked about shock, and as I say, they sort of needed to sit down and sort of have big discussions. So what is the biggest worry? Healthcare is the biggest worry. British pensioners currently receive free healthcare through reciprocal arrangements existing between EU countries. This might not be guaranteed post-Brexit. People might need to pay or use private healthcare, which isn't often available to those over 75 or with previous health conditions. Many British people in Spain live on a British state pension and are actually only just surviving. Pensions should remain, and I expect to remain, exportable, but the annual index-linked increment might not. Also, the exchange rate fluctuations and the drop in the value of the pound has a knock-on effect for these people. Brexit also has an impact on identity, especially their identity as European or British citizens. People talked about no longer being able to identify with Britain and felt abandoned by the UK government. What I want to do now is just tell you the story of a gentleman, Ralph, who I met in Spain in February this year. So Ralph is in his 90s. He moved to Spain over 30 years ago, and actually he moved on his doctor's advice. So when he was in his 60s, he developed severe arthritis and other health conditions, and was told moving to a sunny climate would alleviate and sort of help that. So like many others, he chose Spain. Spain is sunny. His pension could go a bit further because it's slightly cheaper to live there. So he moved to Spain, and his health showed remarkable improvements, and he enjoyed many happy years in Spain. Nearly 30 years later, unfortunately, his wife has died. He's in his 90s. He's become frail and is struggling to cope. He can't walk unaided, for example. So he has some help from social services and also pays for a private carer for a couple of hours a day. He has a British state pension, nothing else. He just rents his apartment, and he's now really struggling to cope. A drop in the value of the pound has meant that his state pension no longer covers his living costs, and actually what he's having to do is cut back on the amount of care that he pays for. Having said that, despite his poor mobility, he does still get out and about on his electric scooter. He goes to coffee mornings hosted by Age Concern, and he also goes to a weekly karaoke night. Doesn't drink, just that's where his friends are, and he gets out and he has a sing. He has lots of friends in Spain, and actually no one in the UK anymore. Spain is his home, and he doesn't want to return, but he's worried that if healthcare doesn't continue, that he might have to. So Ralph and many other British pensioners in Spain are worried that they might have to return to the UK, especially if in the case of, for example, a no deal or hard Brexit. Most of the people have said that they would be forced to return. Spain is their home, that's where they live, and they don't want to leave. Now, the question, of course, is what happens if hundreds of thousands of elderly British people return to the UK? So as this image by a Brexit campaign group in Spain depicts, how would the NHS cope? So currently, the UK pays around €3,500 to cover the healthcare of every British person living in Spain, every British pensioner living in Spain. But if you actually calculate the actual cost of return of these people, if you take into account the NHS, social care costs, benefits like winter fuel payments, which are no longer exportable, things like pension credit, which undoubtedly many of the people I've spoken to would be entitled to, and housing, not just the financial cost, but also housing stock, the British government would be worse off, and services would really be stretched to breaking point. Also, the emotional strain of return would leave people really quite heartbroken, having to leave behind their home and their friends in Spain. So there's a massive range of issues to consider. So I just wanted to end by sharing with you something that I'm doing, a new website, www.supportinspain.info, which I've been developing with the British Consulate in Malaga. This contains information in both English and Spanish on a range of topics that is designed to provide information around Brexit on things like healthcare, returning to the UK, and even things like homelessness. So we launched the website in the Costa del Sol a couple of weeks ago. The idea is to support British people and their families, as well as the charities, doctors, social workers, etc., who are currently struggling to support the growing number of elderly and vulnerable British people in Spain, and also the growing need for information and advice during such times of uncertainty. Let's sort of end on a couple of pictures from my launch event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Next to present is Professor Mark Exworthy, who is a Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Health Services Management Centre. Mark's research interests include management, governance and implementation relating to policies to tackle health inequalities, and decentralisation in healthcare organisations. And Mark will talk about the impact of Brexit on patients and the NHS. Mark,
hello. I'm going to be talking about the potential and possible impact of the Brexit, but in some ways the changes are starting to take place and they're being implemented into a period of time that is probably one of the most challenging that the NHS has faced in its 69 and a half years of existence. So probably the most famous picture from the Brexit campaign was this one. I guess you remember it. Who can forget it? And it immediately connects Brexit with the NHS. And what I want to do today is just show you how it's connected in a number of different ways and how that might impact upon us. So we tend to think of the NHS as a national competency for each country, for the UK particularly. So we tend to think of it as not an EU issue. And yet there are many issues here on this slide that point this out. I should point out that I haven't received any EU research. But what I want to do, EU-funded research, but I want to do is focus on two aspects. One is patients and one is staff. So in terms of patients, first of all, should come up in a second, the EHIC card, 27 million people in the UK have an EHIC card. That's about 40% of the population. I was going to ask if I could have a hands up and how many had one, but I can't really see you, I'm afraid, with the lights. Some, yeah, a few, maybe not 40% as such. But this is the one of the main ways in which we have a relationship in terms of patients. Some of the highlight has been that the UK has paid out £650 million to European countries, but we've only got £50 million back in return. Now, most of this money is associated with pensioners, but others point out that it's actually a very small amount. Brexit, will this lead to the end of EHIC? Well, potentially. There's an agreement in principle, but if it was lost, there's a danger, as Kelly was pointing out, that 190,000 pensioners might come back. We would need 1,600 more clinical staff and a cost of £500 million. So the NHS has launched an overseas visitor and migrant cost recovery programme, snappy title, but so far it hasn't recovered anything like the amount that the government thought that it would do, some 97 million. The second aspect I want to look at is staffing, and certainly the referendum generated a lot of interest, and this classic photo of the multinational nature of NHS staff points this out. But just to highlight this, really, the NHS staff is made up of many other different countries. Yes, the EU is important, but many other parts of the world are represented. So if we take out a proportion of EU staff from the NHS, what impact will this have? Potentially quite serious impacts. At the moment, about 1 in 10 doctors come from the European Economic Union, slightly larger than the EU. And currently 7% of nurses come from the EU. So we're quite heavily dependent on our European clinical colleagues. But we have to understand that this is being put in place at a time when the NHS is particularly short of many key workers, GPs and nurses particularly. 1 in 10 nursing posts are vacant. Added to that, the tweet on the right-hand side from Bournemouth, 28 workers, EU workers have left Poole Hospital and 44 the Royal Bournemouth. And this is generating a change which is kind of a perfect storm, really. The red line pointing out the number of workers leaving the NHS and versus the number of people joining. And we see one group leaving at a greater rate than the other. The other issue that relates to this is nursing workforce, and we've seen a dramatic drop in the number of nurse registrations per month from over 1,000 last year to 46 this year. So we've got tremendous pressure being put on the NHS. But how will this play out in terms of the broader impact upon you and me and our clinical care? Where will the NHS sit? And I thought this would be quite useful just to put in terms of our spending. And clearly our economic fortunes are going to be closely tied up with government revenue. At the moment, we spend about the European average in terms of our health spending, more than Spain, but less than France and Germany. This might have a serious effect upon our future to be able to fund healthcare at that sort of level. So, in terms of what we get for our spending, generally speaking, according to the Commonwealth Fund, we seem to do very well. We're a good, high-performing health system. But this is particularly under threat as we move into the period closer to the Brexit day and beyond. And this is particularly important when we consider the current deficit that we're facing in the NHS, 5.9 billion, 6 out of 10 trusts in deficit. Half are planning to cancel or delay spending because of financial pressures. If we add in staffing issues particularly, we're going to be facing a terrible situation. So if we add in the issues that I've been talking about, the mix of EHIC issues, staffing issues, financial issues, we could see a situation of worse access, possibly lower spending, and poorer quality as a result. So the decision of Brexit will have far-reaching implications upon the NHS. So although a lot of uncertainty exists, how we respond and how we as a country respond and how we address that in terms of the NHS will say a lot of, not just about the EU, but will say a lot about our attitude towards the NHS as we approach its 70th birthday. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. We now welcome to the stage Professor Jean McHale, who will also be exploring some of the potential implications of Brexit on healthcare. Jean is Professor of Healthcare Law and Director of the Centre for Law, Sciences and Policy at Birmingham Law School. Jean's main research themes are health law and the EU, regulating cosmetic procedures concerning children and teenagers, and healthcare, human rights and older people. And Jean will be looking at the impact of Brexit on regulating pharmaceuticals and clinical trials. Jean, thank you very much.
The EU's had a major impact, as we've already seen, in terms of the way in which our health provision is constructed. Health law itself, and my main area, historically has been something that's sort of framed by domestic law, but actually the EU's played a really important part in terms of delineating some of the boundaries and substantively regulating in certain areas. I'm going to look at one of those areas now, which is that of pharmaceuticals and clinical trials. Now, there's been major concern about the impact on pharma, something which is fundamentally regulated due to EU law. And so it's been picked up indeed by the Secretary of State for Health and by Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, in their statements in July this year. Their concerns of the impact of regulation in this area and the prospect that it might be undermined, affected and impeded due to Brexit itself. And that moreover, they're clear that even if the negotiations don't itself perhaps provide them achieving their desired relationship with the EU, whatever that precisely is, of course, that there will be greater clarity. Now, the EU has a major impact, as I said, on regulation, some of the structures that are actually here. Community code, in terms of pharma, there is regulation both in terms of central regulation through the role of the European Medicines Agency and also decentralisation that actually works at member state level. Decentralisation is a question of how that will roll on and apply post-Brexit itself. Will this be something effectively much the same? Can we coordinate this effectively as well? We know that a lot of regulation is decentralised rather than going to the EMA at the moment. But what might happen? Are there opportunities as well that could happen from Brexit itself? We need to clarify what our arrangement is going to be with the European Medicines Agency. We know it's leaving London, but what's going to happen in the future? More broadly, what's going to happen in relation to the pricing of pharmaceuticals and other things too, will also, as be seen, not as a primary market in the position that we've got at the moment for this too. Now, Jeremy Hunt's trying to reassure us that this, by and large, that the EU can be involved in this area. The government wants to keep working with them, that we may be able to simply approve drugs for sale in Europe that could automatically be licensed by the UK. But this does not link on to questions of reciprocity. Now, also, too, clinical trials themselves, fundamentally EU regulation. Since 2001, the EU Clinical Trials Directive. This has been reformed. There's a new regulation just about to come in. Claimed it slowed down trials, there was lack of consistency application, and there were problems in multi-centre trials. This is leaving the EU itself to mend the law in the area. Now, we don't have fundamentally entire codification of health research, a lot's domestic law, but the EU's had a huge impact on clinical trials concerning drugs. And so what's actually going to happen to this in the future is really actually quite fundamental. Now, the new regulation that we've got coming on stream, and it's not coming on stream yet, it's due to kick in 2019, and hence the rub really, is going to provide a harmonised system, a new computer system, hence the delay too, and a new central database, and other simplified consent processes, etc. too. So what's actually going to happen to this? Well, initially, under the EU withdrawal bill, slightly controversial at the moment, and in the process of going back to Parliament next week, existing provisions of English law and EU law can be carried over and may still comply. We may still be following it. But what happens after that? The new clinical trials regulations due to come in. What happens if we're a third country? Certainly, there'll be greater inhibitions put in place in terms of what we can do and how our entry into trials themselves are actually regulated too. Now, the EU clinical trials regulation covers this and that status. But there's a major concern out there as to what actually will happen to pharma regulation. Seen as a beacon in terms of safety standards in many ways, will there be a bonfire of the regulations? Certainly concerns from Michael Gove's words in February last year, that this was seen as being fundamentally problematic. So as I said, what is really going to happen? The withdrawal bill by itself will not lead to regulatory consistency in terms of new things coming down the line. And this applies right the way through a whole range of other areas of EU law itself. Also, too, there are major questions about pharmacovigilance, questions of notification of safety questions. There's databases across the EU on this too. Now, we don't know really what's going to happen. And to a certain extent, the UK Health Research Authority have suggested that perhaps there are some things that might work better for the UK. And if we had perhaps simplified regulation, there's a huge debate going on about this and has done in the past in the communities itself of science. But clearly, what is needed is there need to be systems in place to address drug approval and also safety questions, pharmaceutical vigilance. We need to consider how we are going to be aligned as a state with international standards of good clinical practice and how, once we leave the EU, we engage with those sort of debates themselves. New developments at EU level are always going to come down the line. Clinical trials is one example of that. Medical devices, that's the next down the line as well. And how far existing regulatory systems and processes can be seen as realistic and how much we need to align with this. The EU withdrawal bill, despite a lot of rhetoric around this, will only go so far. The implications of any transition arrangement will also have to be considered. Are we going to crash out? Are we going to go with an agreement at the end of 2019? Will there be a couple of years in there? We simply don't know. Thank you.
So we now move on to our next speaker, Professor Raquel Ortega Argiles. Raquel holds the Chair in Regional Economic Development at the Department of Strategy and International Business and at City Ready Research Institute at Birmingham Business School. Her current research work focuses on productivity, competitiveness, entrepreneurship, and place-based industrial and innovation policy. And so she's ideally suited to talk to us about the economic impacts of Brexit on the UK, its regions, its cities, and its sectors. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. The analysis I'm going to present here today is part of a much bigger project subsidized by ESRC, looking at the consequences of Brexit on the UK, its regions, its sectors, and its cities. Today I'm going to focus in the first stage of the project results, that is focusing on what is the effect, the economic impact of Brexit in the regions. So the findings of our initial research suggest that the UK cities and regions which voted more for Brexit are also the most economically dependent on the EU markets for their prosperity. And this is a result of their different sectoral and trade composition. And this evidence can be found not only in terms of share of GDP exported to the EU, but also in terms of the regional labor income exported to the EU. EU trade is the larger responsible for the major volume of trade in the UK, and our results also show that more than 90% of the UK's 37 NUTS2 regions have become more dependent on the EU markets since the millennium, and this is not happening in London. London has become less dependent. EU regional market dependence in manufacturing and services is closely correlated, excluding the case of London. You can see the London in the left side down there. So well, many people are saying that manufacturing are the sectors that are going to be more affected, but actually services as well. Our analysis here has three main objectives. The first one is to study the degree to which EU regions and countries are exposed to negative trade-related consequences of Brexit. We are focusing as well in looking at the differences, the heterogeneity of these consequences at the regional and sectoral levels, interregional and intra-regional, and also intra-sectoral and intersectoral. We are also want to look at the degree to which these sectors are related to the geographical fragmented production processes. So think about the value chains, think about in West Midlands, how much the advanced manufacturing is connected with Europe in terms of the just-in-time production processes. So we are going to look at the fragmented production processes within the UK, the EU, and beyond. So we will be able to answer the question, which shares of regional labor income and regional GDP are at risk as a consequence of future Brexit-related trade barriers. But we will have to think about that this is not the same at which shares of regional labor income will be lost as a consequence. So how are we going to do this? Well, we are going to use the most detailed regional, national, and international trade and competition data sets that are currently available anywhere in the world. These are the World Input-Output database that are covering 43 countries, 56 sectors, and 15 years of trade GDP demand relationships. Our national Brexit exposure index, our results show that 2.64% of EU GDP is at risk, and 12.2% of UK GDP is at risk. Actually, we can go deeper in the regional level, and we see that the highest levels are found for many UK's non-core regions, in the Midlands, in the north of England, and many of the ones that voted for Brexit. Actually, London and Scotland are the ones that are less exposed to this kind of risk. In the case of Europe, we have seen that Ireland, Irish regions are the ones that are also sharing the kind of higher risk exposure to GDP or to Brexit. And in the case of European heterogeneity, we have seen that the highest levels of risk are in the UK, followed by Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and then other regions that are in Southern Europe, like Italian, Spanish, or Greek regions, they seem to have a lower rates of risk. But if we look at sectors, we can somehow divide. Here we have pulled together some sectors, so we can see that in the case of the UK, manufacturing is the sector that is going to be more exposed, with regional variability from 20 to 51%. While we look at West Midlands, we see that local GDP in West Midlands is going to be exposed at a rate of 12.2%. And in the case of local labor income, this is accounting for 11.3%. Mainly, when we look at the sectors, we see that this rate is even higher. So manufacturing is the most affected sector, followed by primary industries. Manufacturing in West Midlands is going to be affected around 33 or 32%, depending if we measure by local GDP or local labor income. And services, they are also exposed at a lower rate, at the level of 7 to 9%. This is mainly due to the sectoral composition of the economic structure of West Midlands. And here we are only looking at the tradable sectors. We have to think about that other sectors, such as construction, that are more localized, even if it still has a rate of 4% of exposure, they are less exposed than tradable sectors. So the conclusions of this first kind of paper that we have produced in this project is that UK regions seems to be more exposed of Brexit trade relationships than EU regions. We have seen that there is a substantial regional heterogeneity, and this is why we consider that it's good to analyze this type of economics inputs, taking into consideration the heterogeneity at the regional level. And we have seen that there is a very important economic geography logic when we see that the levels of exposure in this in the main affected regions are the ones that are going to be in the northwest part of the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel. And we end this evening's presentations with Professor John Bryson, who's Professor of Enterprise and Economic Geography. John's research examines economic geographies, knowledge production, and the role of different actors in these processes. And John's talk will focus on the potential implications of Brexit for the region, so living and working in post-Brexit Birmingham. Thanks, John.
Right, so now for something completely different. The project I want to talk to you about is nothing to do with Brexit, because we had funding from every single research council in the UK and Innovate UK to think about the complex and integrated challenges facing Birmingham, and how can we identify those challenges and what are the solutions to those challenges. The project started prior to Brexit, and we've been working through the Brexit period. Now, I'm not an economist, but I do have a crystal ball. And what my crystal ball tells me is that this isn't the European century, it's not the Asian century, it's still the North American century. And what's happening within North America is going to be critical for the evolving global economy. But my crystal ball is better than the average economist, because when I look into it, I'm always right. So the University of Birmingham can tell you for the first time that Christmas is coming, and it's on the 25th of December. This year, next year, and every year. Now, one of my friends was William Baumol, who died earlier in the year, the great economist. And he once said, economists should never predict the future. All you should do is think about the current times. Now, the Birmingham Project has identified what we call the Birmingham plexus, a set of connections that impact on better outcomes for people or make people deprived and disadvantaged. The interconnectivity of our transportation system impacts on our economy and health and housing. And what we have is a divided city where people are advantaged and disadvantaged. We have Ladywood, we have Aston, but we also have divided parts and disadvantaged parts around the edge of our city. So what we're seeing is very much a city in which, for Brexit, some people will be dramatically impacted. For others, it doesn't matter. So I want to talk to you about three types of communities. EU migrants, we've learned an awful lot this evening about health and migrants, and then I want to talk about UK citizens, those that are very advantaged, and those that are less advantaged or very disadvantaged, living brutal lives in brutal environments and brutal conditions. Now, for EU migrants, Birmingham is a migrant city. In 1665, an Act of Parliament was passed in London that meant that 12 nonconformist ministers had to come to Birmingham with their congregations, and that group led to the jewellery quarter, the gun quarter, the great innovations that occurred within that city, as well as things like chocolate. Within Birmingham, if you want to identify our EU migrants, it's actually very difficult. So you can go down and use national insurance registrations, and what we see is that since 2002, there are 95,000 EU registrations. And the peak year, surprisingly, was last year with 13,000 registrations. So what we see is these waves of migrants coming in from across Europe, descending upon the United Kingdom, providing what? Are they taking jobs? Are they creating jobs? Are they developing innovations? Now, the media story is these are job takers, but perhaps the migrants have a very different role within our society. So what we need to think about is some of these migrants are entrepreneurs. They create jobs. So these are creating 2 or 3 different types of jobs to service EU migrants. So here we have an East European supermarket. And if you go around the edges of Birmingham, what you will see is evidence of these migrant entrepreneurs within our economy. So one of our projects that I've worked on with one of my colleagues, we identified 48 Polish firms. So Polish firms established, interesting enough, prior to the accession of Poland into the European Union in 2004. So 36 of these were established prior to this. So these are entrepreneurs that were predicting the needs for these local businesses. So we can identify 2 types of migrant firms, those that serve just local communities. So these are Polish shops, for example. And then there's another type in which they break out of their ethnicity and they become a lot more important. So one of the firms we've identified and worked on is a firm that was established prior to 2004. They set up a retail shop. That retail shop then acquired and developed a manufacturing unit, and that manufacturing unit then serves one of the big mega supermarkets with products through its UK supply chain. So a migrant comes to Birmingham, develops local jobs, and then develops national jobs. So what we need to do is think about Brexit and Birmingham, and we need to think about the UK residents who are going to be advantaged, the UK residents in the Birmingham residents in which there is no meaning in terms for them for Brexit, and we need to see this very much as a divided city. Now, those divisions are quite extreme. So here we have a picture which I took after Brexit. So this is what the centre of Birmingham is going to look like. Now, this is interesting because the transformation of the library into a new office quarter is all about business and professional services. So one of the key growth sectors of the UK economy is business and professional services. So these are new consultants and new accountants that are being recruited, 7% growth per year to advise British government and companies on how they respond to Brexit. So this is very much the advantage side of our economy, which is growing in terms of these advisory structures. But they're also growing in other parts of the European Union. Now this is the other side. So this is Handsworth, and this is not during the great summer bin strike. This is a standard image of this part of the city. Now we talked to a group of residents within this bit of the city, had no idea what Birmingham City Council was, hadn't heard of it, hadn't heard of Brexit. They're not within the census, they don't vote because they are unemployed, living in hostels, they are disadvantaged, they are excluded from these discussions. So this is the other part of a city. We have well-paid advantage consultants advising companies, and the other side we have these people who are excluded and disadvantaged. Now they're disadvantaged because of an absence of local decision-making. Now there is another side to our city, and the other side is a great migrant city with a very diverse, super diverse population with lots of connections to other parts of the world. We're the only part of the UK economy that has a trading surplus with China. We're the only part of the UK economy which has all of those great super diversity links. So I think there's a tension. There's a tension between regional devolution, local decision-making, and this is a time in which the West Midlands needs to stand up. It needs to take control of that agenda and develop local plans that will produce better outcomes for people, while Whitehall is distracted with the Brexit negotiations. Now, I don't sleep at night well, and my sleepless nights are nothing to do with Brexit, because Brexit is only one of very many threats that this nation faces. Terrorism, cybersecurity, the ongoing structural deficit that we've had since 2007 that is still there, the balance of trade. 35% of the jobs that currently exist in the city over the next 15 years are going to be destroyed. And that's nothing to do with Brexit. That's all to do with computerization, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Now, if Brexit is suddenly overturned, there's another threat that's not being talked about at the moment. The current president of the European Commission has argued quite strongly that the single currency that will exist across Europe will be the euro. So if we decide to rejoin Europe, I think it's goodbye pound, hello Europe, and a different set of negotiations that will go on as we begin to try and reverse Article 50. So reversal of Article 50 isn't a neutral issue, it's the start of a new set of Brexit, or the opposite of Brexit discussions and negotiations. Thank you very much.